believe it or not, we're already over a tenth of the way through this new year, 2024. And as somebody interested in property, you're likely to be wondering what's ahead for our housing markets. Now, there's been lots of clues in the news over the first weeks of the year. And joining me today is Dr. Nicola Powel, Domain's Chief of Research and Economics, to discuss Domain's latest reports, uncovering the latest developments in our housing and our rental markets, plus much more. So whether you're a prospective home buyer looking for some insights, a seasoned property investor looking to navigate this market more confidently, or maybe just curious about the current state of our real estate markets, I'm sure you're going to get some insights from my chat with Nicola. So let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Australia's property markets defied expectations last year in 2023 as home values rebounded despite a string of further interest rate hikes. Now, interestingly, this time last year, most economists predicted prices would continue falling over the year, but instead, as we now clearly know, the opposite occurred, and the year finished off with 1 month after the other, interest rates rising. Of course, one of the economists who didn't see our house prices falling was my guest today, Dr. Nicola Powel, Head of Economic Research at Domain. Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for having me back on.
Well, you've got access to a whole lot of data and you do a lot of research at Domain. So I'd like to ask you some questions and thoughts about 2024. Everyone's putting their hat in the ring with ideas. Now, again, both of us know that short-term forecasting isn't really helpful. It's much more important for investors and homeowners to take the long-term view. But it's hard not to give some thoughts. So, as I started to say, prices grew well in 2023 last year. What are your thoughts about house price growth in 24?
So, look, we are forecasting prices to continue to rise in 2024 over this calendar year. I think, by no stretch of the imagination are we forecasting that it's going to be a boom time in our housing market. And I think that really is reflective of the affordability constraints that are really weighing in, not only in borrowing capacity, but mortgage repayments. But we are expecting prices to continue to rise. We have got a forecast of growth between 5 and 7% across Australia for house prices, slightly lower for unit prices. But it's the same old cities, really, that we are expecting to see slightly stronger rates of growth. And that is Sydney, it's Brisbane, it's Perth, and it's Adelaide. And that, Michael, probably doesn't surprise you that we're picking out those cities.
That's true. Now, I've puzzled a bit about why Melbourne has underperformed over the last couple of years. And I agree with you that it's not likely in the short term to be as strong as, I guess, Adelaide and Brisbane. On the other hand, that would suggest that being Australia's now people-wise, population-wise, biggest capital city with all the immigrants coming in with a shortage of supply, that Melbourne would have inherent intrinsic value. It's going to eventually get back to mean reversion and catch up. The gap can't be as big. But there's a lot of factors, many of them political, that are affecting home buyers and, I guess, investors who are not happy with some of the decisions that are going on there.
I couldn't agree more with you there, Michael. I mean, it's been a really unusual period for Melbourne's housing market. It saw real massive shifts in population dynamics that really weighed into the housing market, not only during the peak period of the pandemic, but also over 2023. We still haven't seen population dynamics go back to where we would expect them to be as they were pre-pandemic. We've still got net interstate migration is just edging into the negative, when normally it's actually quite in the positive overall for Victoria. But you're exactly right. We are forecasting, it's been very unusual. We've seen I would describe as a slow but steady recovery. We've got unit prices further along their recovery than house prices, but we're expecting that the market to still see that slow and steady recovery over 2024. We are predicting that house prices will be and unit prices will be recovered by the end of 2024, but you're exactly right. This whole concept of value for money, I think, is going to be one of the aspects that actually draws people to Melbourne. And that political conversation around higher taxes and rates, I do think it has been an element of, it's almost like Melbourne's had the post out of investors do not invest
Stop
here.
picking on us.
But I think it has been the deterrent. I mean, stop making really challenging decisions for homeowners. It's not yourself, but, government. It's been so unusual. I mean, what has been the sentiment that you've seen amongst potential buyers and sellers around Melbourne?
Well, we have a very large property management department managing many properties for clients from all over Australia and in Melbourne. And interestingly, we haven't lost as many properties from our rent roll as many other agencies have, speaking to others in the industry. I think partly because our clients are a bit more educated, but even so, people are selling up, and not necessarily because they can't keep their repayments. They're sick of being picked on and they don't have the certainty of what's going on. So with home investors, it's really people not being comfortable with the government's decisions and not having certainty. With home buyers in general are sellers also. If they sell their existing homes first, I mean, first home buyers don't bring a trade in and investors don't, but most home buyers do. And last year, there really wasn't a lot of choice. So I think many of them sat on their hands, didn't want to pay extra stamp duty, there was uncertainty, and they weren't even sure if they could find somewhere to move. So the Melbourne market's been quieter than I've seen for a long time. Interestingly though, Nicola, it started with quite some oomph this year. Lots of investors are coming to us and home buyers. I think they can see that there's going to be a change sometime this year. I think they can get the sense that we're peaked at interest rates and that inflation's under control, and many are wanting to get ahead of the pack.
I think you used a word there that I think is so crucial in our housing markets, and that's that element of certainty. And I think that I'm picking that we're at a peak in cash rate, and I actually think most Australians will be feeling the same. And I think particularly those savvy investors, I think once we start to see rate cuts, that's what could be really the spark that does bring even further interest back, particularly for a market like Melbourne that has, overall, when I look back at the last 12 months of Melbourne, I've actually been really surprised by how balanced it really has been. It's seen slight rates of growth, but nothing really eye-watering. It's just kind of plodded along onto this slow but steady recovery. And actually, these are market conditions that we all kind of want to see, in terms of just that slow and steady achiever rather than big swings in prices, both up and down.
I agree. Sure. So you mentioned interest rates a minute ago. I think most commentators accept that they've peaked. Now, at the February meeting, that Reserve Bank Governor Bullock left the door open. She basically said they could go up, they may go up, they may go down. We haven't made a decision. The answer is, if she would have come out and said, we've now reached the peak and expect falls at some stage in the future, we'd have gone out to buy more, borrow more, and that wouldn't have been good. That would have been inflationary.
I absolutely agree. I do think there is an element of these statements are being made in order to cover themselves. The line of, we haven't ruled anything in, we haven't ruled anything out. So they are saying that they could move in any way and preparing Australians. So there isn't a shock, when if perhaps that they do move them higher, which I don't believe they are going to do. I think, I actually think the conversation around the cash rate now has absolutely changed this year compared to even late last year. We're all now picking when is going to be the first rate cut. And I think that is the news that Australian mortgage holders or Australians overall really want to be hearing. Is you and I have both tracked our housing markets for a long period of time, and we both have access to lots of information and lots of of data. And the cash rate and where mortgage rates sit is not the sole driver of our housing cycles. It's one element of a very complex picture. But I think, once we start to see the cost of debt easing, it might actually bring people back to market, particularly in our more expensive cities. And I think it will create an additional spark, I think, for entering or buying, selling, or that kind of confidence and that certainty, that beautiful word that you used earlier.
Well, of course, the reason for high interest rates is to bring down inflation. And the Reserve Bank's only got two ways of doing it, Nicola, either raising interest rates or their rhetoric, what they say. And so Governor Bullock didn't want to give too much of positive news yet. And I think she was correct in doing that. But clearly inflation has continued to ease much quicker than most commentators and even the Reserve Bank expected.
Absolutely. I actually think the last 18 months has been extremely hard for Australians. We're living in a cost of living crisis. We've seen many mortgage holders, it's their first time they've ever experienced a period where mortgage rates have been rising. So I think it's been a shock. I think many people are really struggling to make ends meet and find that balance. I think it is one of those trends why overall we did see investors sell off properties over 2023. And that's because we know an investor is actually much more likely to offload an investment property than an owner-occupier. And that makes sense because you would literally sell your shirt off your back to be able to meet the mortgage
You'd eat Maggi
repayment.
noodles every night instead, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Beans on toast. It's your primary
I haven't
residence.
had beans on toast for years. That's a good idea. I used to when I was a kid.
Household favourite for my kids. Once we do start to see rates cut, I think that, and it's also this chat around stage 3 tax cuts and whether that will be inflationary as well. Look, I don't think it will be inflationary because I actually think that we've seen a bit of a change. I think that people will want to, if they can save money, they'll want to squirrel it away for a rainy day. We've all dived into our savings to meet mortgage repayments, to, meet the higher cost of living. I don't think that stage 3 tax cuts will be as inflationary as some are anticipating it to be.
I agree with that. It depends at what tax rate you are, how much you're earning, but the average family may get $3,000-4,000 a year, and that's not going to change the needle. That's not going to move the needle on inflation. But our savings that we stashed away, that we squirreled away over COVID, have been spent keeping up with the cost of living, paying for the mortgages, higher fuel costs, electricity costs. So I agree with you. I think if they get a little bit of a tax rebate, and again, it's not a one-off saving, it's just the fact that you are paying a bit less tax every week, so you don't get a bulk amount. I think people are going to slowly stash it away or rebuild their savings again. So I don't see that as inflationary or necessarily pushing people to buy properties. I guess what that means is that there's going to be a two-tiered market, a fragmented market this year where some people are still going to be able to buy properties because they've got high income, they've got a lot of equity in their homes. Many don't have to have a mortgage that downsizes, the right sizes. And there's clearly also the bank of mum and dad, or now I've read grandma and grandpa also being good lenders to help their family into the market, Nicola.
And that's going to continue to be a really big trend. I always think that we do forget that we have got a large chunk of homes in Australia that are owned outright. That means that there is no mortgage held on that property, and they have these homeowners have a real stake in the housing market. They don't have to sell. They're not impacted by any changes of interest rates because they don't have a mortgage, or you've got people with large chunks of equity. And I was chatting to someone the other day and we were discussing the impacts of, isn't it going to be the biggest intergenerational transfer of wealth from one generation to the next generation? And, that is going to continue to have impacts. And, it goes back to that conversation of those that don't have property and those that have property. And it is challenging. I think that many people are relying on family members in order to gain access to the market. And, I think it then goes back to, what types of supply, where are we building, are they affordable? You and I have spoken about this many, many times. The undersupply of housing in Australia is there. It needs to be addressed, particularly in those cities that have seen rapid rates of population growth and in regional markets also, which we know have been very popular.
Well, there is a huge undersupply, and many are estimating that we're already starting with an undersupply of around 120,000 dwellings. And even though we need more dwellings, and the government's come up with a scheme saying that we're going to build 1.2 million dwellings in the next 5 years, and of course they're not going to build them, they're going to rely on private enterprise to do that, the sums just don't stack up at the moment. And if you think about it, they're talking about building a lot of new apartment towers, more high-rise, because they can put more people in where they want to live, closer to the CBD in the inner and middle ring suburbs. Nicola, that's where the most expensive land in Australia is. And then they're talking about the most expensive construction techniques, in other words, high-rise towers, as opposed to houses. So there's no way we're going to be able to build affordable dwellings in those locations like the government's suggesting.
Absolutely. And then I kind of go, actually, are we listening to Australians? Are we listening to what Australians want in terms of homes? I understand we need apartments, particularly when you look at the rental market, which is extremely tight still. But we need to have a diverse array of housing. We need that not only in urban sprawl, we need it in those middle and inner suburbs. And it's really interesting because we've already seen the Minns government, New South Wales, come out and say that they don't think they're going to meet that housing target of what their share of it is for the 1.2 million homes. And, what does that do in terms of confidence for Australians around, are we actually going to meet this housing target? Because if we're going to set lofty housing targets, let's do our best to actually achieve that and then continue to actually provide higher level of housing because, this undersupply of housing isn't something that's built up. It's been building for years and years and years. So we need the solution, and then we need the solution to continue so we don't go back to this position that we were in.
I think it's a good point there that this isn't something new. It's come up over a long period of time. Now, one of the challenges is we should be building more medium density apartments or even townhouses in our middle ring suburbs. But there are the NIMBYs, the not in my backyards. There's also the notes, not over there either. But having said that, you've recently written about the YIMBY movement. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Look, we love these types of things in terms of, creating an acronym. Property market loves an acronym. So this is the yes in my backyard, overtaking or replacing the no in my backyard. And I think, what we've got at the moment is local councils do have a lot of planning power. And I think that what you have, and that's what that NIMBY effect is, if somebody within that, local government area doesn't agree, the council won't approve pretty much that development. And what we're saying is I actually think we need to have a revolutionary and visionary approach to housing. And what that might mean over time is powers are actually taken away from local governments. And, we need to keep suburb characters, absolutely. But what we actually need to do is build suburbs across Australia for the future and really be visionary in that approach. And, there are some examples, and I actually think this is going to gain greater momentum over time because I don't think in all of the I've been analysing property in Australia now for a decade. I don't think I've ever seen supply at such the focus, under such a spotlight. Some of those examples, and you've probably got some in Victoria as well, but the ACT is now allowing blocks over 800 square metres that are RZ1 to be subdivided. New South Wales have also seen new planning rules to fast-track low and mid-rise housing. So it's about fast-tracking greater density. So dual occupancies in all R2 low-density residential zones, changes to density around transport hubs and town centres. And the tweaks that they are suggesting could add about 112,000 homes across Sydney, Hunter, Central Coast and the Illawarra and Shoalhaven. And, I think there's been some changes as well occurring in Victoria, but these are examples of governments making slight tweaks to planning changes that will help to bring greater density and higher supply or more supply.
In Victoria, each council has different regulations. So one council we do a lot of medium density, dual occupancy dwellings developments in is the city of Glen Eira, which is very friendly to densifying, pulling down an old house that's past its use-by date and putting townhouses on. Now, Nicola, I believe townhouses are a great way for young families and older people to live, big accommodation, but on compact blocks, and you don't necessarily need a big backyard if you've got a park down the road or other recreation facilities as well. But Glenara is very friendly, and then you just cross the highway, cross the road to the city of Bayside, where they make you stay a bit further away from the back boundary, the side boundaries, the front. And even though in theory you can build two, practically you can't build two townhouses because they just don't fit on with their regulations. So the local councils, in my mind, have a little bit too much power. Having said that, they have over the years changed development approval plans where there's a lot of new developments happening along the main strip shopping centres, all those old shops being pulled down and now apartments on top of shops. And I think that's good, revitalising the shopping centres. I don't think they're good investments, but it's great there's lots of people living there helping the local shopping centre. But a street or two back, if we could pull down some of the old houses and build two modern townhouses, again, it doesn't pulling one down, so you're not adding that much extra. But you've got to have a number of different ways of living. Not everyone wants to live in apartments, do they?
Absolutely not. And this is where that missing middle of affordability or missing middle of housing, and that is those terraced home townhouses, where it's much more affordable. People want their own space. I think, they want a garden. It was really interesting. I was reading something the other day, and it was about repurposing buildings. So, what you've got now is young families are living in those outer suburbs, and there's a lack of schools in some of those outer suburbs, but you've got more schooling in some of those inner suburbs, but not as many children per school, if that makes sense. And it's about repurposing some of those buildings where you get then this distribution of demographics differently, and it actually then changes the pulse of, well, where do you actually need schools? Where do you need that infrastructure around the schools, the daycare centres, on all of this? And this, really speaks to, we've seen a lot of sprawl, particularly in Melbourne. Melbourne is very good at sprawling, but we need to also have it complemented with that density within those inner and middle suburbs too. So it is a fine balance. It is a bit of a fine art.
Well, you don't only need houses. We talk about a housing shortage, but there's also an infrastructure shortage. And sure, the roads are busier, but the infrastructure like sewerage and water, schools, healthcare facilities. I was speaking to Ross Elliott, an urban planner from Brisbane a couple of days ago, and his suggestion was some of the inner city office buildings that people don't need anymore can easily be transformed into vertical schools, high-rise schools. And I said, yeah, but they're in the CBD, Ross. And he said, yeah, but we all have hub-and-spoke transport systems, all our capital cities, so people will be able to get on the buses or the trains or the trams in Melbourne and get to the CBD to schools. It was an interesting idea.
It is an interesting idea. And, the flip side of that is many of us also work in the CBD. So if your child is going to school in the CBD also, I know we go on catchment areas, and catchment areas are dictated by where you reside. But then it also opens up the conversation of, is that the right approach? Lots on the table, I think, Michael, in terms of big picture discussions to be had.
Well, our urban planners are going to have a lot of challenges. Let's hope they get it right. Recently, Nicola, Domain released its rental report. It showed that we've started off the year with record low vacancies. What other findings did your report have?
So we release a monthly vacancy rate report, and in January we did see, so we do it at the end of the month, so technically means that February began with a record low vacancy rate across Australia, so it sits at 0.8%. What I would say though is this is the seasonal pattern that we tend to find. So you do find in December, and over December you see a lift in supply, and then the demand comes in January and it absorbs that higher supply. So it doesn't surprise me that we've seen that vacancy rate shrink. What I am anticipating is we're likely to see it track slightly higher over the coming months. I think it's interesting when you start to paint the picture, and it's all about pulling different stats to overall give you a lens on what is actually happening. Now, it's still a strained rental market nationally. Some cities are in a more dire situation than others. But overall, we look at another metric, which is called views per listing. So this is basically the number of prospective renters per listing. And nationally and across all of our capital cities, it's actually declined over the year. And that's been a pretty consistent trend where we've seen an easing of views per listing. So what that says is actually the demand side of things is coming off of its peak that we saw, over 12 months ago. And I think eventually what we'll see is that will feed into a slightly higher vacancy rate. Still going to be challenging. We're still expecting rents to rise. But I think even rents rising, we released a rent report very recently, and that showcases that rents are rising. Many areas, most of them are at record rents, but the pace of rental growth is also easing.
In other words, there's still a shortage of properties. We believe that a balanced market is somewhere between 2.5% vacancy rate. In the old days, it used to be said 3%. I don't think that's the case. In other words, where renters can find a property within a short period of time, landlords aren't having vacancies for a long period of time. When vacancy rates get very high, there's lots of options for tenants. They can bargain a little bit. It's the other way around at the moment where things are getting leased, properties are getting leased within the first week or two, the first open for inspection in many cases. So tenants don't have as much bargaining power. But rents have increased considerably. And in my mind, Nicola, it's not landlords taking advantage, greedy landlords taking advantage of tenants. If you go back over the last decade, there was many years, other than the last 3 years, where rents didn't keep pace with inflation or just the cost of owning a property. But I can't see an end to this. There's no end in sight in the short term, is there?
It's going to take some time, I think, to rebalance the rental market. I do think that we have seen an extraordinary period of rental growth. And you're absolutely right. There was a very kind of sluggish period prior to this kind of COVID bounce that we saw in rents that has continued even after kind of the borders open. It put, the rental market was pressured, and then overseas migration came back. It was like a pressure cooker. But yeah, you're right. Supply takes a while. We really need investment. And, this kind of theory of greedy landlords, I agree with you. I think that most landlords are mum and dad investors. Rents rise reflecting market conditions. They reflect the level of competition. And, there's been discussions around should there be rent caps. But, personally, I'm actually very against rent caps because what that does is actually masks market dynamics. And so it doesn't allow professionals and government to actually understand, well, what are the real dynamics of our housing markets? How tight are they in the rental market? So rent caps aren't the solution in my mind. I do think that it all feeds into going back to what we probably opened this conversation with, and that is about supply. It is about rental supply. It's things like build to rent, which we know Melbourne is pretty much the leader in Australia in terms of providing build to rent, but it's still very much in its infancy in here and in Australia. But not just build to rent, other things. We need to encourage investment activity. We need more social housing as well, because I think overall we've seen a lot of lower income households that should be in social housing actually go in the private rental market, and it really creates a challenging environment.
That's not the environment any of us want in Australia. People should be able to find accommodation. And while I'm comfortable that the government's allowing private investors to provide a lot of it, I think the government has to do its share to provide for those disenfranchised people that we're always going to have. So build to rent is the concept, of course, where a corporation builds large-ish complexes to not sell. They're committed to keep them in the rental market for a long period of time. And in return, they're getting incentives from the government to do it. What I'm not that comfortable with, Nicola, is it's your and my tax money paying for corporations to be landlords when I'd rather the government give us incentives to do it. But I can understand the purpose of this in some ways. They're building it to scale. But again, it's not going to tip the needle. They're talking about really small number, a couple of tens of thousands of build-to-rent apartments over the next few years. That's not going to go anywhere near to filling the void that we've got of rental apartments. And again, in particular, because it's corporations building them, they're not building affordable accommodation. They're building nice accommodation that they're getting premium rents for.
There is that argument too, but I think, even if it's, say, premium accommodation at premium rents, also it does take away some element. It adds supply. But I agree, we need, we need to actually advance it much further in terms of helping to shift the dial. When you look to the US and the UK, where build to rent is much more established, I think it's about 1 in 10 in the US in terms of, and maybe about 5% in the UK. It's not a large portion of the rental, but it does create supply and focused areas of supply in the rental space. So, and that's right. There is no one single solution. There are many that we need to be addressing collectively at the same time.
Well, one last question I'd like to ask you in our chat today is, what do you think is going to happen to first home buyers in 2024? There's still people wanting to leave home, getting married, having babies. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, home buyers have been, they're obviously much more sensitive to changes in affordability. And I think that we've definitely seen those that have been active in 2023's property market were likely to be supported financially by a family member. I think in 2024, we've got Help to Buy that's meant to be coming into place once the next financial year ticks over. That is focused at helping low to middle income earners into the housing market. And actually, what it creates is speed to market. So it's a much lower deposit, but it also means they have to take on much less debt because it's 30% equity of a established home and up to 40% equity of a new build. And so what that means is, the government will have a stake in that home and the housing market, but what it means is it will get people into the market. And I don't know if they've got volume caps on who can access this scheme, which I'm certain that they do. But I do think that we will see more first home buyers come into the market based upon that. On the flip side, you've got, like Queensland has doubled its first home buyer grant. And I'm not a fan of schemes that actually provide almost like a financial kickback of buying a property because what it tends to do is actually add to the purchasing price. So, I'd be really interested to see how the shared equity scheme unravels. I don't know if, Michael, you've had any experience or knowledge with shared equity schemes in other countries.
Not in other countries, but my nephew just recently bought an apartment in Melbourne, his first apartment. He's single, so had a bit more difficulty getting the deposit and the serviceability than a couple would. And so he was able to get a shared equity scheme, and there's a couple of banks that are allowing him to borrow 95% on the basis that the government is so-called guaranteeing it, so he doesn't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance. And yes, one day in the future, if he sells it, he is going to have to give the government its share, but it's got him into the market, it's got him out of home, and it's worked really nicely. Just with regard to the Bank of Mum and Dads that we spoke about a moment ago, I was just, while you were talking, multitasking and looking up some statistics, and it suggested that the parents are giving their kids an average of $33,278. Obviously, that's averaging out. It was a home deposit in 2023. Interestingly, more than 60% of first home buyers received some sort of financial assistance from their parents to buy their first home. That's a huge percentage, Nicola. This is a survey by finder.com.au who suggested that collectively the Bank of Mum and Dad last year gave $35 billion to their kids. So they're classing it as the 9th largest lender. Also, parents are helping their kids pay their mortgages or supporting them with guarantees. So there's a number of different ways. And I guess that's going to have to continue moving forward. I know I'm helping my kids, and in fact, I'm paying my grandkids' school fees. But I'm in the position to do that and help my kids. And I'd rather give with a warm hand now than a cold hand down the track when I'm not around. And I think more and more people are recognising that yes, they need to help their kids get a foot on the ladder.
I absolutely agree with that. I've got very young children, 4 and 8, and my husband and I talk about how can we support them when they get to buying a home, and they're years away from entering the housing market. But what my point is, I think as parents or grandparents, we're always thinking, how can we help our children or our grandchildren. And, what I ultimately want to be able to provide is firstly a great education and the best education that we can offer them. And then secondly, how can we help them actually get a roof over their head? We all need shelter. We all want the security of having a home. We all know what that does to financial wealth as well. We think like that more so now because of the high cost of actually purchasing into our housing markets. And, you and I have both looked at and experienced many price cycles. And, we know that over time, prices just go up and up. And you do see periods where they pull back, but it never erases all the growth that you have seen. So, I think it's us future-proofing, isn't it? And I think that's future-proofing for our children and helping them in any way we can.
Well, some people say, that's all just a Ponzi scheme. It can't keep happening. But the bottom line is that there's over $11 trillion worth of residential real estate in Australia. All the loans together are only $2.2 trillion. So it's less than 20% loan to value ratio on the market in general. Sure, some people have overcommitted and taken big loans. When you get into the market the first time, you've got to do that. But it's also part of Australia's culture. So it's not just the government and the banks propping it up. It's the biggest asset class in Australia, bigger than the share market, bigger than the commercial property market. With Australia's population, with the government policy, a business plan to grow to 40 million people by the middle of this century, with more knowledge workers, there's going to be a number of things driving our property markets moving forward. More of us earning more, and more knowledge jobs around, bringing more people in from overseas. So I can only see that pushing up property values. Sure, in the short term, as you said, there'll be ups and downs, but in the long term, it's really the wealth of our nation being able to afford it, plus I guess our demographics, our family formation, that's going to drive our property markets over the long term, Nicola.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, when you look at the future of Australia over the next 50 years, I think that what we'll likely see is, of course, our capital cities will still grow, but I think what we really need to do is focus stronger rates of population growth in other regional cities, so areas like Newcastle, areas like Geelong, and we need to improve, obviously, the connectivity as well between our different cities. And, I think the area that has the capability of doing that sooner would be Southeast Queensland, because obviously they've got the games and you've got huge amounts of infrastructure spending, and what they have is a real unique opportunity to create 3 cities that really are connected to one another.
The problem is their long-term infrastructure projects that definitely should be done, but most governments think in 2 or 3 or 4 year cycles, because that's the political cycle, and I'd rather spend money on where I'm going to get my votes next year, rather than where I'm going to get my votes in 10 years' time.
Oh, very true. And that's where, we really need to think of the future, because thinking on a political election cycle is that's not visionary. I really hope that we do see a better connectivity between our cities. I mean, I've actually really enjoyed watching the impacts that remote working has had, and that has been decentralization from the bottom up, from your everyday worker being able to work from home. Now, I know that we're now going through a period of time where, we've got more organizations doing mandated office days, but even then, many of them are not for, 5 days a week. It's 2 or 3. It's hard, 50% time in the office. What that does is still open opportunity. And I think, us showcasing that we can work from home has really opened up affordability and locations for where people can actually reside. And it's probably been one of the best things that we've seen in terms of driving greater affordability, because it does mean, people can go, well, I might opt for a regional location that's closest to a city, or it's okay being in the outer suburbs. I don't mind that commute 2 days a week.
Sure. Neighbourhood's become even more important, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's really the foundation of what we look for, I think, when we're looking for somewhere to live.
So, Nicola, I always enjoy our chats, and I'm never sure exactly where they're going to head. And interestingly, we have very similar views. Now, clearly your role in Domain is to head their research department and see what's happening to our markets. But I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to the couple of reports that we've discussed. So Domain's not only the place to go and look for your home to buy or to rent, but also some great ongoing regular research data. And you've got a newsletter that people can subscribe to get that. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to catching up with you again in a couple of months' time.
Thanks so much, Michael.
I hope you got some benefit from my chat with Dr. Nicola Powell. It's always interesting to get her insights and what's happening at Domain. Now, if you got some benefit, but you're not currently a subscriber, you don't currently follow this show, why not just stop for a sec before we have the next couple of sessions and click on whichever podcast app you're listening to this on and follow the show, so twice a week you get the insights from my expert guests and me. In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. I'm going to ask you a question about how well you celebrate your ordinary days. I'll explain to you a bit more about that in a moment. But before I do, I also want to ask you a different question. Do you actually have a strategic game plan to get to the next level in your investing, in your business, in your life? Look, you listen to this podcast, you probably subscribe to my daily property update, so you probably are, like many of the listeners, keen to get to the next level. You're keen to grow your portfolio, you're keen to step up. But how are you going to do it? Is your current peer group going to get you there? By the way, it's not more knowledge that's going to get you there. All the knowledge is out there on the internet. Now, well, that's actually not true. The knowledge for the average investor is out there on the internet. And quite a number of years ago, some of my clients came to me and said, Michael, what now? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, we want the stuff that's not on the internet. We want the stuff that's not in the books or on YouTube or on podcasts. And this was a group of really successful, like-minded high achievers who had built substantial property portfolios. And that was the thinking behind putting Wealth Retreat together. Now, you don't have to be at that level just yet, but if you want to get to that level, I believe you should join us at Wealth Retreat 2024 on the Gold Coast at the end of April, because it's not just the faculty, it's not just the information you're going to get from the stage, but it's the people you're going to have breakfast, lunch and dinner with, the people you're going to have drinks with at the end of the night, the long conversations that happen in between the sessions. And I'm obsessed with helping people take their investing to the next level, achieving financial freedom. I've been doing that for over 20 years now. And if you want to, first of all, come into contact with some interesting new ways of thinking that you're not aware of yet, because it's only aimed at those people who are already very successful. And if you want a group of people around you to get you to the next level, go to wealthretreat.com.au, find out all about it and join us. You see, I think one of the things that holds back many people is that they're successfully stuck. You're successful, you're okay. Do I really need to go to the next level? Well, I don't know. But the aim of Wealth Retreat is to take you out of your comfort zone and help you design the next 5 years of your life in all areas, not just money. So you come in with a whole lot of ideas, but you go out with fixed plans, and I will continue on after Wealth Retreat with an implementation session with you. In fact, if you come to Wealth Retreat, I'll back you. I'll back you with my personal guarantee. So join us at wealthretreat.com.au. Express your interest. I look forward to catching up with you on the Gold Coast.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to ask you a question. Do you celebrate good enough? Now, I know there's a lot of high achievers out there listening to this show. So here's the question. When was the last time you paused to acknowledge that good enough can also be a victory? If you're anything like most of the ambitious investors and business people I encounter, you're probably your most harshest critic. You chase the extraordinary, you always want to do the best, and in doing so, you often overlook the ordinary wins. So let me change a perspective at the moment. Consider this. How many times in the last month have you acknowledged your efforts, even if the outcome wasn't perfect? How often over the last little while have you taken a moment just to commend yourself for navigating the day to get through it all with the resources you had at your disposal? Now, here's a little framework I find helpful. About 10% of the days you're going to find you're on fire. You're a powerhouse of motivation. Everything clicks. It all just seems to work. On another 10% of the days, it's the exact opposite. You're drained. The world feels like it's asking too much. It's just a terrible day. But that leaves you with about 80% of the days. These are the average days when you're not soaring high, but you're not sinking too low either. You're just there, ready to face the day. And it's in these average 80% of days where the essence of a well-lived life is found. Now, somebody said to me a while ago, Michael, how do you have such good days all the time? No, I don't, because if every day was perfect, every day was that top 10%, that'd be just the average, and I wouldn't have extra special days occasionally. So accept the fact that 80% of the time, they're just average. Of course, anyone can excel when they're feeling their peak. It's showing up consistently during these, let's call them in-between days, that sets the foundation for success. Now, even if the best you can muster on a given day is just a B effort, it's not an A, then that is worth a celebration in itself. Just applaud yourself for stepping up. And if you berate yourself for not achieving A standards every time, that only leads to reluctance to future efforts. It only makes life hard for you. Next time you're inclined to be your own critic, for not reaching the heights of greatness, just ask yourself a simple question. Hey, could you just instead celebrate good enough? Because, remember, every bit of progress, no matter how small, adds up over time. That's the power of compounding. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?